Iran killed 2 U.S. service members at a base in Jordan on July 17, 2026, a direct missile and drone strike against American forces in the middle of a war that was supposed to have a ceasefire holding it in check. Washington had been explicit. American blood on Iranian hands would end everything. So why 3 weeks later is the question still what happens next, and not what just happened? The July 17th strike on Muwafaq Salti Air Base is not just another escalation in a long and exhausting war. It is the specific act that Washington spent months warning the world it would not tolerate. Go back to January of this year. The ceasefire framework that followed the June 2025 12-day war between Israel and Iran had already frayed badly. Iran's economy was in freefall, its currency collapsing, its streets erupting in the largest protests since 1979. Trump threatened U.S. intervention if Iranian security forces killed protesters. And then, in January 2026, they did exactly that. Security forces unleashed a brutal crackdown, killing at least 30,000 people, according to officials in Iran's Ministry of Health. Washington said nothing beyond condemnations. That was the first blink. The second blink came in late February, after the U.S. and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Iran's IRGC attacked U.S. bases across the Gulf, Al-Udeid, Ali al-Salem, Al-Dhafra, Bahrain, and declared the Strait of Hormuz fully closed. American officials called those strikes unacceptable. Then they negotiated a ceasefire anyway. That was the Islamabad Memorandum, signed in June, celebrated as diplomacy working. The administration declared the window for escalation closed. Iran apparently disagreed, because here is the line that actually mattered. The one that was not buried in a diplomatic communique, but stated plainly, repeatedly in public. Any direct Iranian strike that kills American service members on Allied soil will be met with a direct military response. Not proxy accountability, not sanctions, a direct response. That language was specific. It was designed to deter exactly the kind of operation Iran ran on July 17th. At least 2 Iranian ballistic missiles hit the Muwafaq Salti Air Base in Jordan, which hosts U.S. troops and fighter jets, killing 2 U.S. service members and wounding more. Hostilities had escalated following the collapse of the ceasefire between Washington and Tehran. This was not a proxy militia in a gray zone. This was not an ambiguous incident requiring weeks of attribution. Iranian ballistic missiles, an American air base, 2 dead. The documentation is not in dispute. Now here's the tension you have to hold. Iran has tested American red lines before, and Washington has blinked each time. The January crackdown, the February Gulf strikes. At least 16 U.S. service members had already been killed since the U.S. and Israel launched the war on Iran in February, and yet the administration kept returning to the diplomatic table. Every time Washington absorbed a hit and chose negotiation over retaliation, Iran updated its calculation of what the United States would actually do. That pattern is not speculation. It is the documented record of the last 5 months. So why is this time different? One specific structural factor. The Islamabad Memorandum's 60-day negotiating window, the framework that was supposed to produce a final UN-endorsed deal, is now collapsing in real time. If the 60-day talks collapse, Iran's potential steps include reclosing the Strait of Hormuz, renewed attacks on U.S. bases and Gulf energy infrastructure, and a sprint to reconstitute its nuclear program. The July 17th strike did not happen in a vacuum. It happened inside that closing window, which means Washington is not just deciding whether to respond to 2 dead service members. It is deciding whether U.S. deterrence means anything at all before the architecture holding this entire region together falls apart. That is the weight of what just crossed the line. Washington has blinked at least twice since January, so do you think they actually respond this time, or does Iran's calculation prove correct again? Drop your answer in the comments below, because the answer to that question determines everything that happens next. 3 weeks of silence from Washington is not caution. It is a decision, and Iran is reading it the same way it has read every other pause since January. The constraint is this. The Islamabad Memorandum's 60-day window expires in mid-August 2026. Senior officials inside the State Department and the National Security Council are not primarily calculating how to respond to 2 dead service members. They are calculating whether a military strike collapses the last remaining diplomatic framework before the UN Security Council can formally endorse a replacement. That is the political trap Iran walked Washington into on July 17th. Strike now, and you own the wreckage of the deal. Wait, and you have absorbed a direct attack on American forces without consequence. Iran chose that timing deliberately. This was not a desperate escalation by a regime losing control. This was a calibrated move by a government that has studied Washington's decision tree for 5 months and found the exact pressure point where the cost of acting and the cost of not acting feel roughly equal. That is sophisticated coercion, and it is working. Now walk through what happens if Washington stays frozen past the window closing. The first threshold Iran reaches is reconstitution. Iranian engineers already restarted centrifuge assembly at hardened facilities following Operation Epic Fury's partial success. Without a credible military threat forcing a halt, that timeline compresses fast. Nuclear analysts estimate Iran could reach a threshold enrichment level within months, not years, if the diplomatic architecture collapses entirely. The second threshold is regional contagion. Saudi Arabia's crown prince has already signaled, through back channels that Gulf diplomatic sources have described publicly, that Riyadh will not wait indefinitely for American guarantees before pursuing its own deterrent options. That is the non-proliferation architecture beginning to fracture in real time. Once Riyadh moves, the entire framework of U.S. nuclear assurances in the Gulf, the commitment that has kept the region from a proliferation cascade for decades, becomes a historical artifact. The third threshold is the Strait of Hormuz. Iran partially closed it in February and reopened it as a bargaining chip. A second closure, this time without a diplomatic off-ramp in place, would push global energy markets into territory not seen since the 1973 oil embargo. Think about what that means for American service members currently forward deployed across the Gulf, at Al Udeid in Qatar, at Al Dhafra in the UAE, at the 5th Fleet's headquarters in Bahrain. Those are tens of thousands of people sitting inside the blast radius of Iranian retaliation if Washington does strike, and sitting inside a collapsing deterrent structure if it does not. A US or allied military response would not be surgical. The targets that matter: hardened nuclear sites, IRGC command infrastructure, ballistic missile production, require sustained strikes, not a one-night raid. Iran's retaliation would almost certainly include simultaneous attacks on those Gulf bases, on Israeli population centers within range of its remaining missile stockpile, and on commercial shipping in the Strait. The human cost lands in Doha, in Abu Dhabi, in Tel Aviv, and on American flight decks in the Gulf of Oman. The red line was not rhetorical. It was a structural load-bearing commitment, the kind that holds an entire regional order in place precisely because every actor believes it will be enforced. Every day it goes unenforced, that structure carries more weight on cracked foundations. 2 American service members are dead on Allied soil from Iranian ballistic missiles. The window to respond before the diplomatic collapse makes response impossible is measured now in days. Watch whether Washington acts before mid-August. That answer will define the credibility of American deterrence in this region for the next generation. Subscribe for more as this unfolds, and watch the next video on screen now.